Omer Bundy was not educated beyond the 7th grade, so all his jobs were manual labor jobs. He was never consistent in one thing or in one place. He was a nomad of sorts, bouncing from one job to another in one town or the next. Rowena said,
"He'd have to go away every now and then and find work and pay up our bills, and then come back for a while and stay, and then after a while he'd have to go back on a job again and pay off the bills again, because you have to eat."
Omer's first real paying job was at the age of 16, and he worked through his late 60s. Here is a short list of the jobs he did.
When I was young, my dad worked for the Sahara Hotel in Las Vegas, and he was a yard keeper down there. And when he would come home on weekends sometimes, and I'd go out and meet him, and he'd sit down and put me on his lap and give me some peanuts. He brought me a pocket full of peanuts. I think I was probably the only one he brought peanuts to.
Omer served in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints until his dying day. In the early days of the church, there were few callings, and a person was called to serve in a position for many years. These are a few of the ways that Omer served. Omer's passion was temple work. His home was just a few blocks east of the St. George, Utah temple, and he spent many hours per day, many days per week serving there. 3 years before his death, he said that he had completed 38,000 baptisms for the dead.
Probably the most important thing was the day he came to me and said that he was having trouble with his arthritis, but it was his temple day to work in the baptistry. And would I be willing to go and take his shift that day, which I did, and apparently did well enough that the brethren in the baptistry the next week told him what a good job I had done. And 2 or 3 weeks later, he came to me and said, his arthritis was bothering him again, and he just didn't want to get into the water, and actually asked me if I would take over his shift, which I was more than happy to do. And that began, for me at least, a long period of time wherein I worked in the St. George Baptistry.
Omer developed a love and talent for music somewhere along his way in life. He never had any formal music training or lessons, but he had a natural ability to sing and play music, both in tune and in rhythm, and it is something that he loved to do in his old age.
Grandpa Bundy, as I remember watching him sit there on a couch in the front room with either Don or Glendon or somebody playing the guitar, and him playing with his spoons or the bones, and also tapping away on the back of a tambourine with the backside of his hands in rhythm to whatever they were playing. We did have some good times with Grandpa, even though for the most part he was rather elusive and just went about his own thing.
But this is what's prompted me to do this, especially at the reunion this year. I thought, there were just under 1,000 people there this year, well over 1,000 people last year, and I thought, how many of them know that my Grandpa Bundy had any talent music-wise at all? And then I thought, there's probably less than 2 dozen that have ever even seen him do this. I have these items. One is this little brace that goes over the head. I have his harmonica. And he could play a lot of songs. His playlist, he had a playlist of about 12 songs. And we'd have to go through pretty much all of them. And I knew the different chords to all of them. The Bear Went Over the Mountain, Turkey in the Straw, You Are My Sunshine, Down in the Valley. And so he would clip this harmonica to this brace around his neck so that his hands would be free. And he could play the harmonica across the board without having to use his hands, because he would then fill his hands with a couple of other musical items. For one, he played the juice harp. Always amazed me watching him play this juice harp, that he could get enough breath to actually make that thing sing, and he did. But this is his tambourine. And then these are his, what they call the bones. And so he would hold the tambourine in one hand, he would hold the bones in another hand, and I can't do it. And I've never come across another person that can do it, and I have tried. But he was so good at this because he could play the tambourine in the initial rhythm, the initial beat. And as he would play it, he would jingle the bells, he would hit his knee, he would hit his elbow, he would hit his head, and he would be doing all that the time that he's going across the harmonic at the same time that he's playing his bones. And I could never get his bones to work the way that he did, but he could get the bones working in like 3 times. So if this is going in the main rhythm, he'd get the bones going in another rhythm, and he'd be playing the harmonica in whatever song, such as The Bear Went Over the Mountain, he'd be playing that kind of rhythm. And to watch him do all 3 of those was absolutely amazing. And he loved it when I could play guitar, because that reminded him of the times at the old schoolhouse on the Arizona Strip, that somebody'd have a guitar and a fiddle, and then it would just be these and the music. And I've often wondered, how did people actually dance to that if you didn't have an amplifier to amplify those guitars? Well, he had all the rhythm that he needed, and these were really quite loud. And the style that he played harmonica was amazing to me. I've never been able to find anybody that could play the same style that he plays. Even as an old man, I don't know how he got the breath, because it required so much breath, the style that he played. And like I said, I've never found anybody, and I can't. I play the harmonica, but I can't play it like he did, because the amount of breath that he could get.
Omer was far from perfect. In his later years, he acknowledged his mistakes, and like all of us, wished he could do things a little bit differently. But aside from his imperfections, he made a great contribution to the world. Here are just a few ways he has made this world a better place.
when I talk about my angel heart Grandma Rowena, was the best thing that ever happened to him. He made a lot of wrong turns in his life, he made a lot of mistakes in his life, but he made some good choices, and that was the best choice he ever made. Because as loving as she was, and loyal as she was, probably the only woman on earth that could have or would have withstood those many years of hardships that they went through. And my grandfather later in his life did understand that and appreciated that.
You know, Dad was very talented in music. He played the harmonica, tambourine, the bones. He played anything that you could make rhythm out of. even if it was a pot or a pan or anything else. He was very talented. And you know, on the 4th of July, I remember when he'd get close to 4th of July, he'd get out his little instruments, and he and Aunt Mame would go. They had a wagon that was pulled by a tractor, and everybody that played the instruments that wanted to had their own little band, and they would all get on that wagon, and they would go all over St. George. You could hear them all over town playing their music. Anyway, as I got older and I got a guitar, I learned to play that guitar good enough that Dad loved that, and Dad and I would sit for long periods of time, and I would try to play the guitar, and he would encourage me by playing his bones, his tambourine, his harmonica, and all those things.
Since I showed you the bones and the harmonica and the tambourine that Grandpa would play, the other day that I showed you how he did the bones and how he could play the harmonica, and he had a unique style in both of them that I've never been able to replicate. But I did show you his unique style for playing the tambourine, just being his tambourine. And most people, when they play the tambourine, simply play a single beat, like on the bass beat, where they may hit the beat and then shake it. Or sometimes people have a stick that they can use on either side of their hand to try to get that kind of a beat. But if I can do it, the way he did it was so unique, because he would get the major beat, but he would get the beat in between. So if you can imagine him in a small dance hall, and there's guitars and a fiddle, and they need to have the beat to dance to, and he could make this really ring out and sing it, but he would play it with a kind of a double beat. By using the back of his hands on that. I remember one of those times in the 2nd grade, Grandpa took me with him with sacks of produce. We went to Aunt Reddy's house there on South Bluff to take produce to her. He would take produce to his sister Lily. He would make sure that widows in town, they would have wood cut for the summer or for the winter.
But there was always something, grocery sack full of something he'd send home with us.
Well, he owned all them lots clear to the corner down there, so he had that whole thing filled full of garden.
And the whole thing was garden. He had big old rows of corn down through there. And
Mark and Ed Newman and I many times would go load up baskets of corn that we would take on the strip with us, or just take with us because we were going to drag Maine and we wanted to have some vegetables, I guess. Know what kind of garden he had: strawberries, grapes, peanuts, everything that you could grow. He was known for that, and he would go to the market basket up by the temple and get big grocery bags and fill them. One thing I do remember during the first, second grade is that I went with him to Aunt Reddy's house there on South Bluff Street with bags of groceries that he would take to her on a regular basis, that he would take groceries to widows around town on a regular basis. And he was an incredible farmer. As I sit here and I look down across the pasture and to the Santa Clara Creek, I often sit here and wonder what my grandpa could have done with this piece of land. He thought he was in heaven. In our current mission that Glenda and I are serving with the church history, we had an opportunity for a couple of days to help prune the grape vines at the Brigham Young home. And they had a couple of horticulturists and botanists there to tell us, and I remember the guy telling us that grapevines have to be so far apart and you don't let them get more than 3 feet high or they don't produce the very best. I remember telling him that my grandfather had grapevines that went clear around the home and up over the roof. And he said, yes, but they couldn't have produced the best grapes. And I just told him, I wish he could taste those grapes. I remember those huge purple ones, every kind of grape that you could think of. And people would come to the house wanting some of Grandpa's grapes. And he grew them up clear over the house, and it didn't matter how close they were. In fact, on the north side of the house, he had almost a little room that was made 3 walls and a roof of grapevines. And so he had a tremendous green thumb. He had a tremendous heart.
We traveled a lot of that farm area of Grandpa's with a fly swatter in our hands, because he would pay either one of us 1 penny for every grasshopper we killed. But the interesting thing was that many times, by the time we had chased a grasshopper all the way across his property, it would fly off across the street, or at least off of his property, and that didn't count. We couldn't chase them to wherever they went. As long as we killed one on his property, we could turn it in for 1 penny. And we spent a lot of hours running around this property with a fly swatter in our hands for that very reason.
I would watch my grandfather out under the pecan trees, surrounded by grapevines. Some of those would actually come up over his head. Out on his cot, and that little nightstand that was next to it, he always had a cup like this. It always had a bar of soap in it like this. And he always had this brush. And it was only about maybe 3 times a week, 4 times a week, definitely on Sunday, that he would shave. His whiskers would get longer and he would shave. So he'd put this soap in there, put a little water, and he would get a lather that was unbelievable. I mean, it was almost like a paste. and he would lather his face with this. And then he would shave with a straight razor. And it would always amaze me. I actually was able to sit and watch him, which again is why I say these things need to be passed on, because I wonder how many people have actually ever seen him, but he used one of these. I would watch him as he'd reach over the top of his head to pull his face taut, and then he'd take the razor and he would shave his face with it. I actually went out and bought me one of these one time, thinking that I was going to be a real man and do that, shave my face the old-fashioned way. I never really had the nerve. I never really had the guts. I can remember Grandpa, as I'd sit there, his whiskers, I guess, would get pretty coarse, because as he would do that, I would actually hear it scrape. It was like running your fingernails on sandpaper as he would scrape and shave his face to do that. And all of his life, that's the only thing he knew. That's the way that he did it. So apparently, I must have been wrong about some things, because apparently he must have had quite an influence on me. Another thing, my grandfather cared very little about material things. I mean, that was obvious. Just the fact, the way that his family ended up having to live, but he just really didn't care about material things, other than one possession he had that I remember that he always took a great deal of pride in, that he loved, and that's this pocket knife. He always had his pocket knife, always carried it with him. He loved his pocket knife, and it always amazed me how sharp it was. He would use this for anything. He would use this to trim his grapevines. He would use this to peel a slice of turnip off, and then the way he could eat that slice of turnip with the knife still in his hand without cutting himself. He was always had this knife and always able to use it.
This one I remember very well. When I was about 13, I had a paper route. And I rode about 6 miles on that paper route every morning, because it was out on the east side of St. George, and at that time, the east part of St. George was very sparsely populated, and I rode a long ways. And I had no tools to fix my bike when it broke down. Now, Dad had a toolbox, a metal toolbox he kept on the side of the house. And he kept it locked with a padlock. But I had such a scrawny little skinny hand that I could pry it open just enough to get my hand in there and maybe get a tool or something to fix my bike. Oh, sometimes I would forget to put that tool back in before Dad came on the weekend, and did I get scolded, and Dad was mad at me, and as usual, precious little mother was to my rescue. But I do remember from my racing days that Renee and I would always race each other from the bus stop, which was out by the old feed mill, about a quarter of a mile to get home. Mother always had some yummy goodies, and so we would race to see who got home first, to get a hug from Mother. Anyway, when I was about 17 and I was running track, I thought, okay, I'm a little older and a little bigger now. I can certainly outrun Renee. So one afternoon I challenged Renee to a race. So Mom and Dolores, Dad and Dolores went out with me to see who would win. Well, they decided to run along with us, and so we ran the race. And lo and behold, I did beat Renee. But Dolores beat all of us. She beat Dad also. And that made her feel bad because she beat Dad, and Dad felt bad that he got beat. I do remember helping Dad and spent a few times with him going to do his assessment out on the Arizona Strip. Had this old Jeep. Sometimes we'd have to make our own road to get that Jeep to get close enough to the mines where he could go and do his assessment. lots of times when Dad was doing his drilling with what he called a churn, and he would be there hours and hours trying to make a hole big enough to stick some dynamite in to make it look like he had really done some work. Anyway, he had an old Geiger counter. He would send me with that Geiger counter off in the distant country, sometimes at the top of a mountain with that Geiger counter to see what kind of a reading I could get, because at that time uranium was worth a lot of money. So while I couldn't do anything helping him dig, he would send me with that Geiger counter to see what I could find out. I know that when I would go with him to do the assessment, we lived for a couple of weeks on rice and raisins and oatmeal and with canned milk. Yuck! Rice and raisins sometimes have to pick the weevils out of the rice, but it kept us alive, and we always were able to stay out there sometimes for a couple of weeks on the few things that Dad would take out there in what he called his grub box, and sleep on the ground. And it was kind of a fun experience. But I always remember how happy I was to get back into St. George and take a shower and be back to normal life again.
I remember a time that he helped me make a pair of stilts, and when I told Grandma Bundy about him helping me make those stilts, she was amazed that he had actually taken the time to work with me, but it was something special.
I remember one time some people from New York stopped in front of our house, and Mother was outside, and they asked my mother, they said, do you mind if I take a picture of this corn? It's the tallest, beautifulest corn I've ever seen. And she said, no, go ahead. He said, could you tell me where there's any Mormons? And she said, well, we're Mormons. And he said, he was shocked. Where are your horns? And I heard him say that. We didn't have any horns.
I also used to go pine nut hunting with Dad. And I called it pine nut hunting because you had to hunt. Sometimes we'd drive for miles trying to find an area where there are enough pine nuts, enough pine cones to make it worth our time to stop and climb the trees and get the pine cones out. No, it was a sticky, gummy mess. You had to use turpentine to get the pine gum off from your hands and other parts of your body that might have gotten on. It was a sticky mess, and I didn't like doing it. So sometimes I would hide when it was, or I would ditch out when it was time to go do that. Of course, Dad had Hap and other people that would go with him. usually up around Pine Valley, sometimes out on the Strip, and he used to go up by Panaca a lot.
Told us, me and Stanley, he said, you kids, I went up in the upper lot, and he said, there's a big watermelon up there, and I plugged it, and it isn't quite ready to eat. So don't you dare mess with that melon. Now, if he hadn't told us, we wouldn't have known the melon was even there. But the temptation got to us too bad, and we went and picked it. Then we had a little peach tree up there. He cut a little switch off that peach tree, and he switched our legs with it. Let me tell you what, that green peach tree limb really hurt.
For all the years that I taught human behavior and human development, abnormal behavior, I started off talking about the progression of mankind, obvious from the time that we discovered fire, we invented the wheel, and we domesticized animals, that we have come a long, long way to the point that we're going to the moon and we're going to Mars. And that's the cause, it's the result of one generation sharing with the next generation what they learned. And I guess that's why this is important, that we need to share with the next generation those kinds of experiences, those kinds of things, and those things that we learn and that we feel. So even though I guess I was critical of my grandfather's life, I wondered what he had to show for a good long life. He wasn't a good cattleman. He wasn't successful as some of his brothers and sisters were. He didn't make a good living off a dry land farm out there, as some did. He seemed to prefer to go panning for gold and go trapping up on the mountain and go hunting pine nuts rather than to provide for his family. So as a critical teenager, me looking at my grandfather at that time and thinking he didn't have a lot to show for life, obviously, apparently he did have some influence. If he had that much influence over me in that short period of time, I have to wonder how much influence he had over many, many others. Obviously, there's no question his life mattered. And even though I guess as we look back on some of our ancestors and we compare them to our own lives and we wonder what they really have to show for life or what their contribution was, we have no way of knowing. We only have that little vignette of our experience with them.